And
Thank you.
I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge the Association of Baha'i Studies Agricultural Working Group, especially the key contributors to this subject. And I feel honoured to even be in their electronic presence at the moment. There's no need for me to duplicate the contributions of these scholars, but hopefully I can do something about focusing on what or exploring the concepts that we need to be aware of in terms of Baha'u'llah's vision for agriculture. I'd also like to acknowledge two of my mentors, and the first of these was my mother, Joy Stevenson, who, when I was about 15 and I said I would be interested in developing myself as a Baha'i scholar, she pulled me up and said, if you think Baha'i scholarship is presenting on your favourite topic with a sprinkling of Baha'i holy dust on the top, you need to think differently. And she explained her model of Baha'i scholarship, which she felt was like a wheel, and it didn't matter where you were on the rim or the spokes of the wheel, providing that the axle and the hub of the wheel were the teachings of Baha'u'llah. And this was her model, and I've taken that on board over the last 60 years. But recently I discovered Baha'u'llah's model of Baha'i scholarship, and it's in the Persian hidden word number 12. And you probably know this. O man of two visions, close one eye and open the other. Close one to the world and all that is therein, and open the other to the hallowed beauty of the beloved. And this is a very brief summary of how we can operate. There is a physical reality and there is a spiritual reality. And Baha'u'llah knows that we cannot close our eye to the material world and function effectively in this world. So the prompt that we are given by Baha'u'llah is to close that eye so that we have a chance to see with our spiritual eyes spiritual reality. Now, knowing that we're going to still have to open our eye to the material world, we develop a very important function, and that is to see things stereoscopically. Baha'u'llah wants us to see things stereoscopically, to be able to see the physical and the spiritual and to perceive depths in reality. And to me, this is a beautiful crystallization that Baha'u'llah has given for how we need to function. The second mentor I would like to mention is my father-in-law, Dr. Qudratullah Vosu. And ever since my wife and I, Suzanne, were married, he would spend a little bit of time with me in the few years that we had with him, and he would challenge me, and he would essentially say, are you going to believe your professors at university or are you going to believe Baha'u'llah? And I would have to excuse myself and say, Doctor, I'm going to have to digest what you have challenged me with. And I realized that there is this disparity between what we are taught in our schools and universities and what Baha'u'llah is presenting. And essentially, the Institute process is to try and get us to think about what has been revealed rather than what we can be taught in the institutions of our societies. I acknowledge the guidance and the insights from advising the Gardens Department at the World Centre. And in that environment, there are many insights that have been developed. And I'd also like to apologize in advance if I cause any grief to anyone in what I'm going to present to you today. But I should say that what I'm going to present is my current understanding and is in no way is it limiting um, either on you or what uh, I might discover myself personally in the future. Now, there is a challenge that I want to look at today, and that is what are spiritual principles and how do we discover and use them? And also, where are we in the awareness and development of the agriculture envisaged by Baha'u'llah and what has yet to be done? Now, when we're talking about spiritual principles, we tend to have a fairly simplistic view of what spiritual principles are. We know that Abdul Baha provided us with 12 spiritual principles that he felt was necessary for the world, but particularly the Christian West, to understand. And we can probably all rattle those 12 off, or at least 7 of them, if we're lucky. But when we look at, and I'm glad when he chose that particular quote, which gets us to ponder on what we really understand about spiritual principles. But when Baha'u'llah says in the Kitabi Akdas, immerse yourselves in the ocean of my words, that ye may unravel its secrets and discover all the pearls of wisdom that lie hid in its depths. What does a pearl look like in the depths? Are you hoping to find something like this? Particularly if you paddle around the edges of the oceans of Baha'u'llah's words. Virtually nobody can find one of these because that's not what you see in the depths. So what are we looking for? Essentially, we're looking for something like this. This is where an oyster is formed and where it is housed at the bottom of the ocean. And a pearl will be hidden within that. And it's the same with spiritual principles. We have to develop an eye for being able to perceive what a pearl oyster looks like so that then we can find the pearls. It's a very interesting metaphor that Baha'u'llah provides us with. And I'll be exploring some metaphors today so that we can start to develop an eye for what there is in Revelation. Now, at this stage, I'd like to start the presentation if I can, and we'll go through this as quickly as possible. So if I can share my screen.
Yeah, I want to point out that I've placed in the chat, you'll see some documents that Paul has made available to us. You may want to talk a little bit about those.
Okay, well, I will introduce these as we go through. I need to use a backspace here. And so don't worry about it too much, Dawn. As we go through this, I will allude to some of those lists that I'll be referring to, and you can post them then if you like. So there should be a context for those as we go through. But I wanted to focus on using Revelation to change culture with a focus on agriculture and horticulture. Agriculture is essentially the art of the field or the science of the field, and horticulture is the art of the garden. This is where the words come from. But we should remember that these are cultures. The science of agriculture as we know it is actually a subculture in itself. So the challenge we have is reimagining agriculture from what it is. And there are a series of questions that we can look at. How do we fulfill the vision of Baha'u'llah regarding agriculture? And how do we develop a model of agriculture by understanding that vision? And what will this look like? Another question is, how do we interpret Baha'u'llah's vision to the Baha'i community and the wider global community? And in terms of interpreting this to the wider global community, there is some guidance on discourse that we should be looking at to get an understanding of how we actively engage in discourse. And you'll see that at the beginning of Book 13 of the Institute process. But unfortunately, in that book, the 5 elements of what discourse is, according to the Universal House of Justice, has not necessarily been drawn out, but it's worth looking at that. Now, these are some of the challenges, but an extra challenge is what strategies do we develop to address these challenges of our development of an understanding of Baha'u'llah's vision about agriculture and then being able to communicate it. Maybe it's worthwhile to look at what we understand by culture. And agriculture is our professional culture. Now, according to definitions on the web, a culture comprises shared beliefs and values. Now, in relation to agriculture, this can include common wisdoms. And a common wisdom is something that is accepted by a group of people as being truth, but there is no foundation to that proof. And a classic example in Australia, for example, is for over 100 years, it was assumed as a common wisdom that the rain followed the plough, that if you cut down forest and you ploughed the soil, you would increase rainfall. And this was accepted as a fact up until about 1930, when it was realised that when people developed this theory, we just happened to have 10 good years when people were clearing land and the rainfall increased. But of course, when you have a drought, it ceases to exist. It also includes theories that we have and first approximations. And a first approximation is something that we have an idea about something, and this becomes our theory, and then we set to prove it. And then eventually we modify that theory according to our experience. So with the reflection process that we're encouraged to go through as Baha'is is to modify our first approximations so that we develop a more sophisticated understanding of reality. Shared beliefs and values can also include assumptions and prejudices. And this is something we need to address as well. Cultures comprise tangible and intangible elements. We need to be aware of those too. And also guidance for behaviour and even thinking. So our culture, our agricultural systems, our agricultural education even tries to control the way we think about certain things. And this is where I see that we have some opportunities to modify the thinking that our agriculture has. Cultures also are dynamic and evolving, and this is where we have opportunities as well. It is also internally diverse, and it is essential in agriculture that we have internal diversity because not every form of agriculture can be applied to all soils and all climatic systems. We have to be able to adapt our model of agriculture to all of these systems. Now, also, cultures are socially transmitted. And again, this is where we have opportunities that relate back to this concept of cultures comprising guidance for behaviour and thinking. It's worthwhile going through these concepts so that we understand what we're dealing with in terms of change in culture. Because if we aren't aware of these dimensions, then it's very difficult to wrestle with them. Now I want to talk about an analysis of revelation, because this is essentially what I'm wanting to talk about today. And I see here that we have several objectives in analysing revelation. One is to unfold the intent of the revealed word, especially the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. And when I'm talking about unfolding, I mean that there will be a word or a phrase or a clause, and we need to unfold what that means. And then each of those elements maybe need to be unfolded as well. And I want to give you an example of this later on. The objectives are also to analyse the example of the central figures of the faith, which is revelation in action. And some of the work that has been done in the past in terms of documenting the Baha'i concept of agriculture relates around the example particularly of Abdu'l-Baha in the development of gardens and agricultural systems such as in Jordan, in Adasiya. I want to introduce Andrew Blake to you, who also has a wonderful capacity to crystallize the examples of Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi in the development of gardens. And this is a subject I suggest that you should ask him to elucidate on, to pick up some insights that Andrew has been able to develop, sometimes in retrospect, using evidence of what Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi did without them articulating what they did. So looking at what they achieved and then how did they actually achieve it, so that we can learn those lessons. And also, we need to be able to discover and articulate spiritual principles that relate to our subject. And I've already spoken about the pearl metaphor, and we don't need to go over that anymore at the moment. Now, in terms of strategies to do this, I've discovered over some 50 years that we need to analyse vocabulary. What do these words mean that are revealed? Especially the imperatives, where we have no choice but to accept what is there. The musts and the shoulds. For example, there is a list for Baha'i scholars. If you wish to consider yourself a Baha'i scholar, are you a true seeker? And in the Kitab-i-Yaqan, Baha'u'llah describes a series of 27 qualities of a true seeker. And the first paragraph comprises 12 musts. A true seeker must do this, must do that, must do something else. And one of the lists that I've given Dawn, and she could post, if you like, a listed version of these two paragraphs. And the second paragraph about the things that a true seeker should have as a quality, or should have as qualities. So 27 qualities in all, and they can be a checklist if we want. But I wanted to introduce you to this concept of lists. And also I mentioned above there the concept of metaphors, and there are hundreds of those about quite often processes, and we need to start to explore these metaphors. For example, let's look at a metaphor, and this is a medical metaphor, an anatomical metaphor that Shoghi Effendi developed, where he said that the funds are the lifeblood of the cause. And everyone understands what the lifeblood of the cause would be, and that is that just like the blood transmits oxygen around the body, the funds transmit resources around the system of Baha'i activities. But have we ever thought there are 9 functions of blood? Have we ever thought about what the other functions of the funds are that are not restricted to transmitting oxygen? These are things that we should explore, because when a metaphor that is of such a high level is given to us, we should be trying to understand it. Now, in the revealed lists, we have prayers, tablets, and treatises. And what I've been using is the Colstow method. And I wish to acknowledge John Colstow, who wrote this book. And he specifically used formatting of the holy text to allow us to understand the components of the paragraphs that are there, particularly in relation to consultation. And you will see in that book, if you look at it, that he did not change a single word. And when you read it as if you're reading the original paragraph, but the way in which it is laid out with different lines for each concept, your eye perceives something that enables you to absorb much more than just reading the paragraph. So I unhesitatingly acknowledge John Colstow, and that is one of the major techniques that I've been able to use for analysing Revelation. We have historical anecdotes, and I've already spoken about that. And we also need to analyse challenges and questions to clarify the way forward. And this is a critical part of consultation for any institution, as well as any of us that are working as individuals, aspiring for scholarship, or working together collectively in scholarship. In the analysis of Revelation, we also need the regular use of prayer, meditation, and reflection. And these are essential parts of Baha'i scholarship, in my eyes. Looking at tools for unfolding Revelation, and I've spoken to you about this concept of unfolding things. With the analysis of vocabulary, we need to also scan for all key words throughout the available guidance so that we understand what that word might be, what it means across the system. For example, recently I've looked at the concept of equity, and I note that in more than 50 cases in the guidance, equity and justice are paired together. And this means that if we're wanting to understand justice, we also have to understand in detail what the concept of equity is. And then you discover that one of the names of God, it only appears once, is the equitable. And when I say it only appears once, it only appears once in the available translations in English. But that's enough to trigger this as being an important concept. We also need an in-depth analysis of key metaphors, identifying, as I've said before, and articulating pivotal spiritual principles. We need to be able to articulate them, not just to say, I've seen it, because we have absorbed hundreds of spiritual principles in our life as Baha'is, but we have not necessarily articulated what they are. And this becomes an important skill in terms of unfolding revelation. We also need to cross-reference key principles within the matrix of universal principles, including recent guidance from the Universal House of Justice. And one of the things we learned from the Universal House of Justice is that the research department of the Universal House of Justice has gathered together a lot of these concepts, and the Universal House of Justice is able to reformat those into something that is relevant for this particular time in history. And as I've alluded to before, with my acknowledgement of Andrew Blake, that we need to analyse, often retrospectively, examples provided by the central figures of the faith. Now, I want to look at one particular metaphor, and this is alluding to a mega metaphor concept, that of the heavens, where Baha'u'llah says, with fixed and steady gaze, born of the unerring eye of God, scan for a while the horizon of divine knowledge and contemplate those words of perfection which the Eternal hath revealed, that happily the mysteries of divine wisdom, hidden ere now beneath the veil of glory and treasured within the tabernacle of his grace, may be made manifest unto you. This is really asking us to look at the metaphor of a horizon. And the horizon of divine knowledge is something that we need to scan. And we need to scan that horizon where spiritual, celestial principles come down and meet material reality. This is a beautiful metaphor. And each of the stars in the heavens are essentially like spiritual principles. And when we look to the west, these principles come down to the horizon at various stages of the night and year. Then we have those principles being able to apply to material reality. And I just wanted to open up this concept of the horizon of divine knowledge, that we can start to explore some of these things. And it is universal that we can work at this across the board. I want to now look at two particular mandates. And one is the mandate for the gardens at the Baha'i World Centre. And this is where it started to pick up some of these concepts that in Revelation are key elements for us to understand. And this is paragraph 133 of the Kitabi Akdas, where Baha'u'llah says, raise up and exalt the sites wherein the throne of your Lord, the All-Merciful, hath been established. And then there's another sentence, thus commandeth you the Lord of ever understanding heart. And about 0.5% of all the writings that we have of Baha'u'llah are of this mode, that this is what God has said. Have you been paying attention? Please understand what has been written. It's an emphasis. It's almost like an afterthought, but it is never an afterthought. It is a reminder that we should pay attention to what has happened above. Now, you might look at this and say, well, what's that got to do with the gardens at the World Centre? But we know that the throne of the Lord has been established in the holy places. The throne of the Lord has been established where the shrine of the Bab exists, has been cited, and we also know that the throne of the Lord has been established at Baji at the Rami Akdas, the shrine of Baha'u'llah. But the key is raising up and exalting these places. And the question is, how do you raise up and exalt something? This is what we need to unfold. And I remember asking this question, maybe I was a bit cheeky, but I asked the question of a member of the House of Justice, what does this mean to raise up and exalt? And the next evening, the wife of that member of the House of Justice went past me and she said, You've kept my husband awake all night. And a few days later, I got a note, or we got a note, the consultants, about the principles of refinement and perfection in the writings of the Bab. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're running out of time, but the Bab in the Persian Bayan speaks very strongly about bringing everything to a state of refinement and even elevating things to the highest perfection so it is not deprived of its own paradise. In other words, if we have a responsibility for a thing, we have a responsibility for elevating it to its highest paradise. Now, you can find both of these quotes in a book by Saidi called Gate of the Heart, about the writings of the Bar. So, if we're looking at unfolding these concepts, we have the concept of exalting something, and that is refining and elevating something to its highest level of perfection. And the consultants that have been working with the Gardens Department have realized that we need to be looking at exalting something as to develop beauty and peacefulness and using prudence. Now, the concept of prudence only occurs once that I can find in the writings in English, but it is a critical concept because an element or a subset of prudence is sustainability. And we are told that we should be working towards prudence in all things. But when we're looking at beauty, and we have some designers who are consulting with the gardens, and they understand the importance of design, and an aspect of design is color and shape and texture of the vegetation. Part of beauty relates to cleanliness and to order. And order has a subset that relates to symmetry and even asymmetry. So, particularly in the Baha'i gardens in Baji, you have asymmetry superimposed on symmetry, and it has a special beauty of its own, this merging of symmetry and asymmetry. And an integral part of beauty is health. Plants that look healthy are more beautiful than plants that are disease-ridden or wilting or even dying. There are subsets of the concept of peacefulness. And you find peacefulness when you enter the Baha'i gardens. As soon as you go through the gate, you find yourself in a peaceful environment. That 5 meters away is a main thoroughfare in the city of Haifa. What are components of peacefulness? And you have sounds and you have smells, and they are things of nature that automatically induces in us the hardwired concepts of what constitutes a peaceful state of mind. Now, I just wanted to use this as an example of unfolding a concept so that we know that we have the opportunity to unfold things that we're presented with in Revelation. Now I want to look at the mandate for agriculture. And I just want to focus on the red bits in this case, because that's the section we need to focus on. The following constitute the fundamental principles for the administration of the affairs of men. So we have a context in the law dunya for what are the fundamental principles for the administration of the affairs of men. Not for the development of us as individuals so much, but the affairs of humanity. And then there's a list of 5 things. And the 5th one is special regard must be paid to agriculture. And we've all focused on this particular sentence. But we need to think about the rest of it. Although it hath been mentioned in the fifth place, unquestionably it precedeth the others. Now, this is mentioned as an afterthought, but the manifestation of God never has an afterthought. So why is it expressed in this way? This is it's related to the hearer. We are the hearers in this case. And we need to remember this in relation to how we interpret this, particularly to the Baha'i community. This is a reminder that although something is mentioned in the fifth place, it precedeth the others. It has primacy. And then there's another section which says, it is hoped that His Majesty His Shah, may God assist him by his grace, will turn his attention to this vital and important matter. So we have no doubt about the nature of this statement, that whoever is responsible as a ruler, a government, or it might be a monarch, that they have a responsibility to address this vital and important matter. So the context of this pivotal mention of agriculture is that it is to do with the rehabilitation of humanity. And why the apparent afterthought? It is to address the hearer's ear. And what does the primacy of agriculture mean? Does it mean precedence in time? Does it mean precedence in importance? Or maybe that's a false dichotomy. Maybe it is both. And if so, why? And I suggest it is primacy of agriculture in both. It needs to be first on the list when we're looking at systems to rehabilitate the fortunes of humanity. It also precedeth the others in terms of importance, because without it, life on this earth cannot function, particularly human life. Without the rays of the sun working with living systems in a matrix of soil, we do not have living things able to function, and we cannot have agriculture. So is there a warning in grievously neglecting this thing? And I think that there is a warning. And if our Baha'i community ignores it, and if the global society ignores it, then we're potentially in strife. And why the imperatives of special, vital and important? And I think that that's obvious to us at this stage. We also need to look at our understanding of agriculture. And the universal definition in English and other languages is that agriculture is the science of practice of farming, including cultivation of the soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products. Note that this definition includes animal husbandry. But if we look at the revealed word and the definition in Arabic, zira'a is translated as agriculture, but refers specifically to cultivation and is probably more closely allied to the definition of agronomy. Now, what is the importance of this revealed word? And as I've alluded to before, it is a metaphor for God and the Son being the source of all life. God is the source of our spiritual existence, and the Son is the source of our material existence. And this is a metaphor, and it's alluded to in this concept of cultivation, of agronomy. And it's also consistent with guidance on the source of diets for the future. And really, it is yet to be clarified whether the distinction between the two definitions that we accept in English and other languages, and the word in Arabic and Persian. It's the same basic word in Arabic and Persian. But I think it's useful to know that there is a primary focus on cultivation rather than animal husbandry. And when we look at matricultural forms, we see that there are things related to agronomy, forestry and arboriculture, horticulture, pomology, which is the art of the orchard, but also in range management and stewardship of the natural environment. But the concepts of animal husbandry and aquaculture and mariculture may be side issues, but the focus is on those things that allow the sun to raise life from the soil. When we look at the names of God associated with agriculture, and I don't know how many of you have actually looked at this, there are over 2,000 English references to gardens and gardener. There's one reference to the holy gardener of the holy garden, and there are 4 references to the holy garden, indicating that even though it's mentioned 4 times, the holy gardener is relevant to those 4 quotations. There are 4 references that I've been able to discover of the divine gardener of the divine garden, and a series of other mentions of gardens that are spiritual gardens. There's another reference to the heavenly gardener twice of heavenly gardens, and there's also a series of references, 5 of them that I can find, of the husbandman, capital H. And the husbandman is a farmer or one who cultivates the soil. And I find it's interesting that these are qualities of God that relate to agriculture. And I would suggest that when Baha'is who downgrade the importance of agriculture, they are missing out on this particular connection that is available to them. There's also an extensive vocabulary and guidance that is associated with agriculture, almost 2,000 references to the field, 190 to cultivation, to cultivate and cultivation. There are 436 references I can find to the soil, but only 8 to dirt. So you can see the numbers that are there. And in some cases, I'm going to put forward a need to maybe change our cultural vocabulary and English and as Baha'is. When we look at a timeline of Baha'i agriculture and horticulture, and I don't want to go through these sorts of items because this is only a minor list and has nothing to do with the detailed lists that Andrew Blake, for example, has defined. But that I want to draw to your attention, and that is that you're probably unaware that in the 1890s through until 1909, Abdul Baha created an extensive municipal garden outside the walls of Akka. And when I mean extensive, it was a large municipal garden. It has totally disappeared. But Andrew can advise you on that at some later stage if you're interested. I also wanted to draw attention to 2007, when this was a pivot point when the global population in cities exceeded that of rural areas. And people in urban areas tend to undervalue agriculture. Now, there are other spiritual principles that need to be applied to our understanding of agriculture, and there are several of these lists. I've mentioned the one about the qualities of the true seeker. There are also in the writings of Baha'u'llah, actions of the righteous. And this is a quotation that we're all familiar with. And Baha'u'llah lists there 33 qualities that we should all be trying to acquire. And of those 33, 23 are metaphors. And we blithely go through this quotation. It's one paragraph. And we don't think of the fact that there are 33 things that we should be developing within ourselves and in our communities. In the letter to the councillors of 2021, paragraph 4 lists 19 qualities of an enkindled soul. And we need to be looking at that list because, again, this is a checklist for those who think that they are enkindled with the teachings of Baha'u'llah. Do you have all these 19 qualities? And remember that these qualities are not excluded from agriculture because as people involved in agriculture, we still have to acquire these things. We're not absolved from this when we are developing a new model of agriculture. And also, the Universal House of Justice has listed 9 principles of Baha'i economics. This is in the letter on living a coherent life of the 1st of March 2017, paragraph 7. And the Universal House of Justice asks us to consider those principles, spiritual principles, that will change the way in which we see economics, in the ways in which we will develop a coherent life in this world. These just happen to be a series of lists, and I hope you find them useful. Again, using the Colstow technique of separating these paragraphs into a series of points that are relevant. So let's quickly look, and I need to tie this up. Agriculture and associated principles. We have agriculture in the centre of this, but then we've also got a series of other key principles that are necessary for a Baha'i concept of agriculture to be formed. One of them is the oneness of humanity up the top. Another one to the right is diet, nutrition, and health. And what are the principles associated with those subjects that are critical to be incorporated into our understanding of agriculture? The concept of environmental sustainability, which the Universal House of Justice says we cannot postpone indefinitely, our taking for granted the ability of nature to be an unlimited source and an unlimited sink of anything we want to throw at it, as well as what I've just referred to in terms of economics. We also have other concepts like equity that I've mentioned, the abandonment of prejudice. And we have prejudices in our national cultures, in our ethnic cultures, but also in our professional cultures. And I've spoken about guidance for all souls because they're the lists that I've just referred to. But there are also a series of other qualities, other virtues, such as detachment, that are critical in terms of us developing a concept of agriculture. And one of those I want to talk about in a second, and that is addressing prejudices and assumptions. And I said before that we all have prejudices and assumptions, but they're not always easy to identify and address. And I want to look at 2 particular prejudices, and that is equating soil with dirt. And we know with the teachings on cleanliness that having dirty clothes is not acceptable. And there are so many laws and principles in the Kitab Aqdas that relate to cleanliness and renewal. And so we tend to have that as an objective. The trouble is that we equate soil with dirt. And they are 2 different things, because if we are to value soil, which is the foundation of all our agriculture, we need to dissociate these 2 concepts that tend to be conflated in our minds. And I'd suggest this is a prejudice we need to address. We may need to even think about how we change our vocabulary in relation to soil. There is also the prejudice, the equating a farmer with peasant. And Baha'is have this. This is a prejudice. A farmer is an uneducated person. It is a person who may not own land, a person who has to rent the land to produce food that we eat. Even though we need food, the people who produce it are not worthy of respect. And we need to do something about that prejudice. And as I mentioned before, the environment we assume as an unlimited source of resources and an unlimited sink for pollutants. And I suspect from your images on the screen that most of you have lived through a time from when the world was limitless to when the world became limited. Some of you may be able to remember it. When this change occurred, when we had to start to think about how much we are impacting the environment. So we have some current and future challenges. The first one is the challenge of understanding. And I don't have an answer to this question. I cannot define for you the model of agriculture that Baha'u'llah has indicated needs to be developed. So one of the challenges is that of understanding, how to define and refine our understanding of Baha'u'llah's model of agriculture and its role in the rehabilitation of human society. And some of you have presented already on the role of agriculture in the rehabilitation of human society, but that needs to be fully fleshed out in more detail. So it is unquestionably a principle that is used by the rest of humanity. We also need to research how that universal model can be applied appropriately to all soils and all climates. And some of you have developed systems that relate to particular soils and climatic regimes. But does that model apply on the other side of the earth? And if not, how do we move upwards with our concept of agriculture so that that model can be universally applied to each environment that we're working on? And then there's a challenge of capacity building and discourse, building our own capacity, but also the capacity of our community, effectively communicating the vision of Baha'u'llah in relation to agriculture to the Baha'i community, and then how to effectively communicating that vision to the global community. And already there are many people in the wider community who already understand the basic technical concepts, but not the spiritual concepts. And this is something that we may need to think about. How do we serve this up to these people who could be very important allies in this process? Now, I need to stop there. I've gone over time, and I'd like to hand over to Dawn, and I don't know whether there are any questions that people want to pursue.
Yes, thank you so much. So if you have a question, you could just raise your hand or.
So don't tell me I've stunned everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, you did, because conceptually, that was the best presentation ever, I think, in this series. We have Arthur Dahl and Paul Hanley, who are also, among the stars of, in terms of relating the revelation to the current practice of agriculture. But I'm intrigued, as a historian, I'm very interested in the major plan of God. And I was just wondering, in Australia, permaculture emerged with Percival Yeomans, Bill Mollison, and Dave Holmgren. Do you know these people, and do they know you?
In this case, I know of them. I've never met them. One of the issues about living on remote islands in the Indian Pacific Ocean, you don't have the chance to come across some of these people. Um, uh, I think that it is important as a concept that there are people around the world who are working on similar wavelengths, and they are developing concepts that explore things that have maybe never been considered before. And occasionally you have things like serendipity. And a classic example of that is um, the development of a smelting system for aluminum, or we would say aluminium. And two researchers claimed that they had done it first. And when the research was done back onto their records on the same day, a researcher in France and a researcher in the United States put the same things together in an electric furnace. And it's a classic case of people working on entirely different geographic areas who had come up with the same thing uh, as to how to solve this problem, how to smelt this, what had up until then been a precious element. And so I think we need to be open to people working around the world for these concepts. One of the issues about being isolated in a place like the Southern Hemisphere generally is that you're not fogged by the thought processes of people in the mainstream. And so you have a chance to think outside the box. But what we need to do, particularly as a Baha'i community, is to be able to bring the learnings together. And if you've ever been to the Holy Land when the Universal House of Justice and the International Teaching Centre are bringing people from all parts of the world for 4 or 5 days to be able to download the learning that they have acquired in the field. And this is a grassroots upward process. You will understand the power of this sort of functioning, of being in learning mode rather than knowing mode. So I don't know whether that answers your question, Neil, but it doesn't matter who we've actually met. The important thing is that we understand the concepts, we're able to pick up these concepts, take it and run with it to develop new developments beyond that first, second, or third approximation.
Perfect.
And I also want to acknowledge the work that various authors here, Arthur and Paul and Winona, have done to bring together these concepts. What I'm trying to present is a result of 50 years of almost being in isolation, but having the opportunity to reflect rather than being driven by other people's thoughts, but then looking at other people's thoughts and saying, is this consistent with what the state of the art is? If the state of the art presented in this volume, or the work that Arthur has been doing for over half a century now, then all of this becomes the platform for us to be able to go further.
Right. Gabrielle?
Just referring to permaculture, but I have another question. I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people doing permaculture in Australia, and the answer is really complicated and couldn't give it in a short, but there's an interesting way that the people that do permaculture behave. But my question is, from personal experience, and we won't have the answer here, is how do we lessen the prejudice by the Baha'is towards farmers as being peasants?
And that's an important question. I think that we need to be thinking about this as a group to come up with strategies of communicating these concepts. And let's look at an important spiritual concept. It is so important that the name has been given as the name of a month in the Badi calendar, and we don't often think about it. And that is the month that we're just going to go into shortly, the month of Masail. That is questions. I think it is important that we ask questions. If you want to pour water into a bucket that is full of water, it's not going to go too far. Whereas a question does something like taking water out of the bucket so that you can put something in. And we need to understand how questions function. They tend to be less threatening than statements. And we live in a society that is constantly bombarding us with statements. Politicians are constantly pumping statements to us. But how do we ask a question? And when we look at, for example, when I've tried to analyse how the central figures of the faith use questions, I've come up with 4 essential types of questions. And sometimes these questions are asked in a sequence, in a list. And my record is 12 questions in a row without any answers. So how are these questions used? And the first type of question is that to test, to examine. And this is the sort of thing that's used in the early sequence of, the early books of the Rui sequence. Then we have a level of abstraction above that. We have questions that are designed to explore. And these are the sorts of things we use in consultation. We explore an issue, we define an issue, we ask questions, and then we address those questions in whatever way we have to do in consultation. Now, there's another level of questions above that, and it's a level of that abstraction, and that is questions that are designed to stimulate and inspire. And they may not have an answer. They're left to us to generate an answer. And the last level that I've been able to pick up, the 4th level, and it's a level of abstraction above that, are questions that are designed to generate a sense of wonder. And they have no answers at all. And this is a parallel to the 7 valleys, where the last valley is a valley of wonderment. And that's left up to your soul to generate some conclusion out of this. Now, what I'm suggesting is that we sometimes need to think about using questions that inspire people to think further, rather than ramming permaculture down their throat. To ask a question that will get people to think a little bit about where their food comes from and the over simplistic system that is currently used to produce food. We can then maybe present the quotations on agriculture to people and explore them. This is where the second level of questions is used. Now, Gabriel, I haven't given you a final solution, but I suggest in there are some techniques that we can use, strategies that we can use that will start to break down these barriers. But what we need to do is to also discuss this collectively so that we are able to generate a consistent way of presenting the message of what Baha'u'llah has given us. Sorry, I talk too much.
It's not easy, is it? All right. Paul?
Oh, that was a wonderful presentation. I loved it. I had a question about Andrew Blake, and then I saw Andrew Blake is with us and what he's put together about gardens made by Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha. Is that sort of compiled somewhere that we could read about it?
Andrew may need to respond to that. And in general, I think a lot of this is a work in progress, but Andrew may be able to give some more information on this.
Sorry, I don't have a good speaker. I didn't hear the question. Would you mind repeating, Paul?
Yeah, my question was, is the information you have about the gardens from Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha, is that compiled anywhere that we can read about it?
No, it's not. It's, as Paul says, it's a work in progress. So some initial analysis has been done, but we're actually in the process of analyzing further. And so a lot of this is based on the design work, but also looking at the complexity of what they achieved and how that might have impacted their understanding and what they put in place. But no, it's certainly a work in progress.
And I should add that a lot of what I'm presenting today has been done in association with consultation with Andrew. He has a special mind. He was involved in the management, the horticultural management of the gardens for a significant period. And he has a special eye for analysis. When you see him analysing a tree that needs to be manicured, I would say there are very few arborists who can match his insight as to understanding the needs of that particular tree. He also analyses photographs and has analysed historical photographs going back to the beginning of the use of photography in the Holy Land to analyse things that may not have been recorded in words, but have been recorded visually, even when certain trees were first established in the landscape. But anyway, I won't embarrass him any further, just to say that he has a lot to offer, and it may be that he could compile some of his findings into a presentation without actually having to go to print with this. So I will leave that with you.
Thank you. Arthur?
Thank you for a beautiful presentation. It's really a source for deep reflection. The question that I would raise is that how do these concepts relate to our whole concept of community? And I think, we live in a society where there are property boundaries and people have their little gardens and so on. And yet, given how important food production is, we can't live without food. We would think that any Baha'i concept of a community must be much more integrated with the whole food production process, partly because for education of children, learning to grow food, it's so important that little children learn about growing food and are in the experience with the garden and contact with nature. And so it seems to me that there are a lot of assumptions to question and to ultimately throw out with respect to how we imagine the agricultural process, the whole gardening process fits into the way we design communities. I mean, I can remember in the Pacific Islands where people might have had the soil, the land was a common property, but you might have a right to use it for use particular part of time, and it would be shared around and so on, and a much more effective use of the land resource because it was managed on a community collective basis based on the needs and capacity of each individual. It seems to me that the kind of thinking that you're proposing allows us to go much more deeply into how would we imagine. I mean, the Baha'i communities aren't going to be giant mega cities. The only reference I've seen in the writings to a city is around the Bay of Haifa, the third world civilization. But the Baha'i institutions, a house of worship, a local spiritual assembly, a 19-day feast, are much more human scale. And therefore, one might think that agriculture also should be at a much more human scale, much more integrated into the way in which we live and design communities and work with that capacity of the land to support us and to feed us. So I think you're opening some fantastic doors that we need to take further. And maybe you have some thought on that already. Thank you very much.
And I think that you've raised a critical issue, Arthur. And while community was not part of the model that I had put towards the end, I think that it is a critical element of the whole process, that we cannot isolate uh, individuals and the community. One of the prejudices or the assumptions that we have with agriculture as it is at the moment, particularly industrial agriculture, is that it is a money-making enterprise for individuals and corporations. And therefore, it is being isolated from the concept of community. And if we look at one of the first texts that looked at the concept of environmental degradation, The Tragedy of the Commons, by Garrett Hardin in the 1960s, which looked at communal land being the commons, and then how it can be brought crashing down by these ownership concepts. So I think that the question you have raised becomes a critical key point in our collective consultation about Baha'u'llah's model of agriculture, which is different to industrial agriculture with a few tweaks, or as my mother would say, a sprinkle of Baha'i holy dust on the top.
Thank you. I think we should take this thinking much further. Thanks for getting us to go in that direction. I knew Garrett Hardin when I was at university, in fact. I go that far back, but I didn't agree with everything that he said, but it's clearly looking at common property and, rather than his materialist view, how we share, developing it together, and how we become organically part of the natural system and not separated from it. Thank you very much.
And I think it also relates to this concept of living a coherent life that the Universal House of Justice wrote about in 2017. And we should all study that letter. And if for any reason you want a study version using the Colstow method of that letter, I'm happy to share it. But the Universal House of Justice addresses the assumptions that we make. And one of the principles of Baha'u'llah is that wealth is admirable, providing everybody is wealthy. And this is another concept that we need to be able to absorb into the models of the future that we need to develop. But can I say, Arthur, in relation to this, I think that we've had several subject letters from the Universal House of Justice, things like living a coherent life. We have one on involvement in politics that was addressed to the Friends in Iran, the letter on peace of 2019, and just recently the letter on marriage and family life. These are subject letters. It is possible that we could get a letter from the Universal House of Justice about the importance of agriculture. That's one strategy the Universal House of Justice might use to bring this to the attention of the Baha'i world. But on the other hand, the Universal House of Justice may be waiting for us to develop a coherent model that can be taken up and presented to the world. So there are two choices I see. One is that we wait for things to come down from on high, or we do our homework and we develop a gift that can be given to the House of Justice to be then used universally as the foundation for the reformation of humanity.
Winnie?
Dawn,
Yes,
I can't find how to
That's
raise
fine.
my hand.
that's fine. Go ahead.
You just exactly explained the response that was given in the 1990s when a group of people wrote and asked for a compilation on agriculture, such as the statement on nature. And it's exactly what you said, that we have to come forward and show what's being done and how many people already are wishing for that statement. So thank you.
Can I say, and I hope nobody's listening that shouldn't be, I think the brain power that we have in this group is sufficient to change the formation, the reformation of humanity. We just have to use those Baha'i skills of consultation and collaboration to be able to come up with that model.
Thank you. Joe, did you have something to say?
I was trying to put it into a form of a question, but I was thinking about civic agriculture as a subset of agriculture, since I live in a city, which includes things like community gardens and using, say, a city's land bank, leasing a lot from a land bank. So I'm wondering if you have directly applied some of these ideas you were talking about to that subset of agriculture. And I don't know how to ask these questions because my computer kept going in and out, so I missed a lot of parts of the presentation. And I would associate that too with the sneaking suspicion. This is my prediction that the main arts of the future are going to be gardens and community festivals, which sort of ties all these things together. And it makes me think of the Hopi and their concept, Techkachi, which means sort of cultivate the earth and celebrate life, and how we bring these things together. And I'm thinking this is all kinds of things that you were kind of indirectly talking about, and I don't know how to ask the questions on that. And then I got triggered with the idea of pruning, and you mentioned Mr. Blake, and that makes me think of these sort of have you considered these offbeat metaphysical ways of gardening, like in Finhorn, where they're communicating with the spirit of the plants, and how the Baha does refer to a vegetable spirit. And I find it interesting when you look at a shrub or a tree and you're going to prune it, you think about where I'm going to prune it, but you could use a pendulum and get yes or no answers and ask the tree itself if that's a place where it wants to be pruned. It takes a little bit longer, it's a little bit woo-woo, but that might be a question for the future. How do we incorporate sort of the notion of the spirits of nature into our practices?
Yes, this is a question that I'm sure Andrew would be able to address as well. But I think that we need to be thinking about it, a universal model, and it is going to need to be retrofitted into certain situations like cities. And also, there will be opportunities for the total change of rural areas in some form or another. But we need to have all these ideas together. I think the critical thing about what Arthur has been alluding to is the concept of community. And the Universal House of Justice has been inserting some specific concepts in the system. So we are starting to change our thinking. And one of those is the concept of neighbourhood. No matter where you are in a city, if you recognise your neighbourhood and you function as a neighbourhood, it is essentially a village. And so our whole system can change just by thinking in terms of these spiritual concepts about how we form communities, and that becomes a foundation of all sorts of developments. But anyway, I think that there's a lot for us to work on.
Paula?
Yeah, thank you so much. I must admit, I'm quite overwhelmed by what I'm learning tonight. Yeah, thank you very much. But when you talked or when you addressed this model, I was just wondering, do you see any glimmerings, any small beginnings in the example in Cauca del Norte in Colombia with Van Dijk? Because they already having they addressing the spiritual and the material. Yeah, and you talk about this universal model or the model that can be applied to climate zones and everything, but wouldn't there be an essence in this in Cauca del Norte to for the world or for the Baha'i world to get deeper into this? Because it's mentioned, we meant, like, I'm from Germany here, and in our Association for Baha'i Studies, yeah, we mention this, but nobody really deals with it, and as you mentioned this, I'm wondering, are there glimmerings for this model, what you're talking about? And
I suggest that there are glimmerings, and unfortunately it is fragmented. There's learning here and learning there and learning somewhere else, exploring different dimensions, and there's nothing wrong with this. But what we have to do is to bring this together into some coherent form. And the coherent form may be a level above. It may not deal with permaculture as a practice, but it will allow for permaculture to be a critical element with the essence of permaculture where it will work. So we need to be thinking strategically about how we bring this together rather than saying it's going to be what they have in Colombia or it's going to be what they have here. Because it's still fragmented, we need to bring all of this learning together, as I said, into a coherent form. But there is a lot of work that's being done on the ground, and we should be grateful that this work has been, in some cases, the work has been going on for decades. And one of the things that has been developed in Colombia that relates to communities is that there is a capacity building program In the West, we tend not to deal with the PSA program, preparation for social action, but it's the sort of thing that develops capacity within societies that do not have access to tertiary education. We have access to tertiary education in the West, and we tend to get blinded by the systems that are propounded by our agricultural professors, rather than things that will work at the grassroots. And until these things have been brought together, and I'm really grateful that Arthur has raised this issue of how communities fit in, because this is critical.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, I was going to share, but I guess maybe one of the thoughts that I have, which is already being said in many different ways, this current plan that we are in is to embrace our neighbors and embrace the world, to become part of a community that works and consults together. So clearly, as we know with all of the friends, that have shared with us, that there are great minds within the Baha'i community, but we must assume that there are also other great minds out there outside of the Baha'i community that are going to embrace the teachings, and it will unfold even greater wisdom and knowledge. And so the term that was shared with us today was, a first, a second, a third approximation that this, as already inferred, is going to continue to evolve and continue to develop as we embrace the wider community and the wider community embraces us. I feel like the model will continue to unfold in its striving towards perfection.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know if there are any more thoughts before we close. We've kind of reached the end here. Any more thoughts?
I think Paul should be the Professor Emeritus of ABS Agriculture Group. He's got so much, he's got this broad vision of all the dimensions, but I really hope we use him as a consultant going forward, as with the others that were mentioned. I thought tonight was absolutely transcendent. I'm going to share it with it was so great.
Thank you. I did want to mention that in the chat, I posted again, if someone has come in later, these documents. And Paul, maybe you want to mention something about what these documents are, these lists.
Essentially, these documents are key lists of things that I feel are relevant to an understanding of the writings that when the central figures of the faith provide us with a paragraph, we need to be thinking about what we pick up from that paragraph. If you listen to a talk, and my presentation might be an example, you take away three things. But what are all the other things that were mentioned? And one of the things that we need to be able to do with Revelation is not to miss out on anything, because it's part of a package. And when the Universal House of Justice says there are 19 lessons learnt by enkindled souls, and they've crystallized this from all their learning up until 2021, and the Universal House of Justice may now be able to add to that list of 19 qualities of enkindled souls. But the first one is that they seek to gain an ever more profound understanding of Baha'u'llah's teachings. That's the first of 19 qualities. But there are also qualities like they champion rationality and science. They advocate tolerance and understanding. And going down towards the end, And while they would not pretend to have discovered all the answers, they are clear about what they have learnt and what they still need to learn. And the last one is setbacks leave them unfazed. So if you feel fazed by it, you'd better develop a bit more resilience and become unfazed. Anyway, they're just a series of lists that you might find useful, but it was really to provide an example of how we can start to think about Revelation in a more nuanced way so that we become much more in a learning mode. And I think this is one of the things when we have collaborators outside the faith, that we emphasize that we are in learning mode. We're not in knowing mode. We can just say, this is where we've got to so far, but what have you got to offer?
Okay, maybe just one more comment. Mabel, did you have a question or comment? And then we'll close.
Yeah, it's a comment. I am very grateful for this presentation and really touch the point that we, a group of people Baha'i, did as a conclusion of study the Adasiji book. We thought that that is really what we need to do. We need to do a model. We didn't put it as a universal model, but as a model that, of course, needs to be applied and find a way to put in different places. But yes, we are in the same pace, and I am able to work and collaborate in any moment for that purpose, because I think it's about the time also. It's very important, the situation in the world and the maturity that we have. We can start to concrete something and left something for be applied. And of course, this will in time get more and more perfectionist, get more perfect, but start with something is important. So thank you very much. And I am able to any time to help and participate in something.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Very wonderful. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you.
My love and greetings to you all.
Yes, to you too.